would have been a good week to have a bit more Christmas in it, a bit more joy to the world and peace on earth, goodwill toward all, and all of that sort of stuff. So I thought to myself, well, we can just do a few things here and there to make our worship service more like an Orthodox service. How difficult can this be? They worship God, we worship God. They're Christians, we're Christians. Let's just do a little bit that's sort of Orthodox-ish, at least. And then I did some research and realized that no, that was not going to happen. Because first of all, for them, worship, now this is again just stuff I've read, I don't have a lot of experience, but worship is ideally a 3-hour come and go sort of event. That you can come, at some point in the service and it sounds like they spend a lot of time preparing for worship in terms of like kissing this and praying there, right? But as the worship service is going on, now the good news here is that the 3-hour service has been cut down from the original 5-hour service, right? But that still would be difficult, right? Especially because traditionally there are no pews in an Orthodox sanctuary, and so you would be standing for whatever time you were here, however long, at whatever point you decided to come, and then at what point you decided to leave. And I, as the pastor, would be standing at the front of the church the entire time for this whole 3 or 5 hours. But 75% of the service would be congregational singing in some language or another. And it would largely be the same songs every week. So you would know all of this stuff probably from birth. Now, that would be very different. And that would be stuff that you can't just sort of pull off for the week because it's just not the same, right? And there would be so much that would be beautiful about that. Because the liturgy itself is much more like meditation. It's much more like it doesn't have to be something new. It doesn't have to be something different. In fact, it shouldn't be something new. It should be, in fact, the point is the repetition. And so much, like Deb said, so much, it would be so different because it would be so visually different. So I asked Scott to have a couple of pictures ready here. So if you can sort of show us one of them. Right? So if you came to church this morning and it looked like that would be a bit different, right? Especially if we go even more traditional and we take out the pews, right? And it's very, very visual. Part of both the aesthetic, both in the Mennonite Church and in the Orthodox and in the Church of the Brethren, is that plain is important. We deliberately do things plain so as not to distract ourselves from the word, right? So from a Mennonite perspective here, we're supposed to look at this and go, look at all those distractions, right? But the Orthodox would say, no, look at all that focus, right? What are we going to focus on if we see that? Well, we're probably going to focus on God and Jesus and the saints and all of this stuff. And so when your mind wanders in the middle of me talking, right, there's all of these other things to remind you of what you're doing there and to remind you of worship. So it's a very different way of going about things. And it's not like something that you could, easily pull off in our humble little sanctuary. And yet the parallels are also so interesting. Right? That so much of traditional Orthodox worship is about community. It's about being together, just like we like to gather together, right? And it's about doing these things because they are our things, because this is the way we do things. And it's not membership in the bureaucratic sense of your name is on a list somewhere or something like that. That's all fine and good. But it's membership in the sense that if you're not there, you're missed. And that this is part of what you do, and this is part of being part of the community that is, right? So there's these things that are so very different, and yet their purpose is very much the same as Right? It's one of the major purposes of our worship service, which is to create a community. So there was all of this new stuff in the Orthodox in the Orthodox service, and yet when it comes to Christmas, most of it is things we would recognize. Right? There'd be a tree, there'd be gifts, there'd be songs, different songs, but still songs, right? And there'd be essentially, so importantly, family and community. So all of these, right? It's like Orthodox worship would be very strange. Orthodox Christmas would be different food, different songs, but the same basic elements, things we'd recognize. So all of this, right, was preparation I started, and then the week happened. And right, so there was both the election in Georgia, which, right, was should have been its own week's worth of news, right, and the storming of the Capitol, which is obviously going to be the next 2 or 3 months worth of news. And I wondered, is there any connection? Is there any connection between thinking about Orthodox Christmas and thinking about the events of the week? And I think there is, right? And I think that connection is precisely the one of community, because Orthodox worship is about community, right? It's about tradition. It's about who you are. It's about being grounded in ritual and family and language and culture. And if you do all of these things, you know who you are, you know what you are, you know where you belong. And that's why I chose both the scripture for this morning and the songs. Right? The Gospel of John starts out with mystery. Right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He wasn't, right? All of these things, right, are not so much statements of faith, but statements of mystery. Right? And the connection between ourselves and God, and the connection between ourselves and Jesus, and the connection between Jesus and God, and all of these connections are precisely about connections. They're about our connections to each other and our identity specifically as children of God. We are the people who repeat these words. We are the people who sing these songs. And all of this is wrapped up in mystery. That's an important component in all of this. And my sense is that the folks who stormed the Capitol this week didn't have this. And they didn't have this because testosterone and conspiracy theories don't make for good community. Right? Just like Facebook and Instagram don't really make for good community. Now don't get me wrong, I like Facebook, right? I've got an Instagram account. And they're great ways to connect with folks you already know. They're great ways to maintain community. But they're not a substitute for real people. Right? As we're finding out now, as we spend more and more time on Zoom, right? And it's almost good enough, sort of, but no. Right? We still want to see each other. We still want to sit down and talk in a face-to-face sort of way that just connects us differently. And I think we saw this weekend, or this week, this lack of community that these people had. First of all, in the size of the group, I was surprised at how few people there were. Like, weeks and weeks was spent, and organization was spent, maximizing the number of people who were going to be there. It wasn't that big a group. It wasn't like the Million Woman March or the March on Washington or even a decent-sized Black Lives Matter gathering. Right? And not only was there not a lot of people, but they didn't have a plan and they didn't have a goal. They didn't know exactly what they were trying to accomplish. And you can't have tactics unless you have a goal. So they went in there and they sort of looked around and took a few selfies, and then they got kicked out, and they didn't really have any plan for staying, and right? And all of those things, I think, happened because it really wasn't a community. It wasn't a group of people who were gathered together for a purpose that they could have easily spelled out, right, which would have been a goal. Right? My sense is that people found a community of sorts in the Make America Great Again group because they lacked a real one. Now, I'm not asking you to empathize or to sympathize with these people. We're not going to find some sort of middle ground and gather together around the fire and sing Kumbaya. Not going to happen, right? And we're still waiting to see whether the justice system has enough integrity, right, to go forward and actually bring justice to this situation. We don't know what's going to happen. Because so far, I think the message in this week is that white supremacy won. People were allowed to go home. There really haven't been the great mass arrests, right? The politicians have made statements and the media has squawked, right? But there's been no real consequences because the people who created this movement are the rich white men, and there's no consequences for them at all yet, right? So it's going to be tricky going forward, right? But it also makes me so grateful for this real community, that I have you, and we have each other. And I think that's where we can circle back again to orthodoxy, that the Orthodox Church shows us the church as an alternative to fake community. It shows us people who are grounded in ritual and tradition, and because of that, they know who they are. Now, orthodoxy is also facing challenges. The reality is that right now in the United States, there's the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church and the Armenian Orthodox Church, but there is no American Orthodox Church. Somehow, right, the Orthodoxy has not yet created the new tradition, the transition fully to this place while maintaining community. So it has its challenges. We have our challenges, right? It's not like the Church of the Brethren or the Mennonite Church has solved all of its problems either. If you follow that politics, it's another mess entirely. But here we are. It is so good to see you even just this way. It is so good to be together. And it is so important that we continue to strengthen one another and care for one another. It's a crazy world we live in. Let's hang in there together. Amen.